Great. Well, thank you all for joining for this meeting of the Isolation Working Group. I'm hoping that that everyone has the agenda open in front of them. Christopher, you have the first item there.
Yeah, it's just a reminder. I recorded last meeting's kickoff, and I actually didn't publish it in part. We did mention a specific customer name. I didn't even realize it when I heard it. So it's just a reminder that if we can, let's keep them out of them so we can publish our recordings. But we want to also remain customer confidentiality where customers have requested it.
Right. Well, I have the next point. Also, just my apologies for not pushing along too much further with the facilitation as I've been on leave over the past week. But I'm hoping that we can continue working through the issues that we've raised now. Two issues were raised off the back of the last call, focusing mostly on the two problems that we addressed or that we determined we were trying to solve. The first one being about customers who want to be on their own stack, and the second being about the idea of reducing the problems when there is something that's gone wrong on GitLab.com. So both of those issues have been raised, and some discussion has started on both of those. Part of that being trying to clarify exactly which problem we were identifying on each of the issues. And I think we've got some clarity there. Thanks, Craig, for the great comment. I've incorporated that into the description. It would be helpful if people can continue to put their notes onto those issues so that we can progress there. There was also an additional issue that was tagged for this group, and I just wanted to find out if we thought that this was actually appropriate here. This was about the Redis sharding.
I put my thoughts below. I think this is more specific to the scalability team, personally.
If no one else has any thoughts about that, then I think I'll ping that over to the scalability team and ask them to take care of this one.
Yeah, I guess like my only question again, and maybe I'm coming in late, I apologize, is to me, I mean, if we're talking about blast radius, we're talking about resources being overused to the point of that having causing outages or affecting other customers, then to me it bleeds into isolation. So that's where I think that there's actually sort of a mixing of these things that I need to understand.
I think where I'm drawing the differentiation is with the noisy neighbor problem, right? Where a customer can do something that negatively affects services, whereas this one seems more like configuration or infrastructure that we can reconfigure so that we are not causing our own problems. So that's why I think it's more of a scalability infrastructure team problem. But I'm happy to be overridden if this seems more aligned with the isolation working group.
I think I'm in agreement with you, Craig. The one thing I'm thinking about is just right hand, left hand. So it is if I'm trying to think how best to say it, if we can't have conflicting implementations, maybe is the right way to put it from that perspective.
Yeah, if this isn't fixed, then customers could cause a noisy neighbor problem because of this improperly configured sharding.
Right. But I agree that like the noisy neighbor problem in itself is not this isn't the noisy neighbor problem as they've currently defined it. They've just said we're going to run out of capacity, and then that's going to cause other issues. I agree with that.
Okay. So the final thing I had, since this agenda remained light, I was wondering if we'd be comfortable using the rest of this time to answer some questions from Fabian around further ending the requirements of this problem domain. And I'll also leave that up to Fabian if that's something that you would want to do on this call.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I missed last time because I was on GitLab commit, so I may be a little bit behind. So I apologize if some of those things were discussed already. But I looked at the last meeting notes and said so people sort of stopped because I think you ran out of time before some of the questions that I actually had. And I think for me, I can't answer any technical implementation questions, right? So that's not, I think, why I'm here. But for me, reading those issues, I think we're sort of postulating that certain problems exist for customers. And I was just like, the first thing that I wanted to understand is, have we spoken to customers and confirmed that these are the problems that they actually are trying to solve? Like, how confident are we that these are the problems that are actually plaguing our customers? And then things like the sharding for the databases or like isolation concerns, for me, sound a lot like, you know, the solution to that problem or to a problem. And I'm afraid I can't help very much with the solution implementation. But I was just wondering, like, how confident are we actually that we've really understood the problems that our customers are facing in this regard on got.com specifically? Because to me, that is not 100% clear, or at least I haven't seen the data, and maybe we need to generate that data if it doesn't exist.
Here's my reading. So in this case, the topic was brought up because of the noisy neighbor issues, and then the idea was brought up by the engineering and the infrastructure team. And in this case, I'm thinking that at least one of our customers is the infrastructure team. Maybe get some idea what they had in mind, what goal we want to achieve here, short-term, long-term, so we can prioritize our activities around this initiative.
I think to Fabian's question, we had a customer specifically ask about data isolation, right? So to go back to the two concerns, we have the noisy neighbor concern, which I can link to an old conversation where we talked about that in our 10X conversations. And then separately, for whatever reason, compliance or whatever, we've had customers ask about data and service isolation. And I think it was in line with compliance, but it might have also been SLO concerns. I'm not sure what the specifics were.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, because when I hear concerns about data location, that often is compliance driven, as in they don't want to share specific data with other tenants, or maybe they even have requirements about geolocation where, you know, they need to keep certain data in a certain place. Is this something that we are also considering in this working group, or is that out of scope? Because I think that is potentially a huge problem for larger customers, enterprise level, and because they may be quite concerned about, you know, their compliance.
So I think for this group, it's the isolation aspect of it, not the location aspect of it. Meaning, so from my point of view, we had a customer where we had an issue, we had to stop runners, and that essentially stopped everybody's runners because we wanted to kill one job. So we want a way to be able to deal with issues and minimize the disruption to everyone else when we're chasing various specific things. And then from the compliance point of view, it's more about, we may run into some customers, mostly federal government type things, where they have a strict requirement for not sharing spindles with someone else. They obviously share the path because everybody goes through the same front door and the runtime is probably okay, but they don't want their data at rest to be sitting with, who knows, you know, someone else. So that's where the isolation really comes into place. The location itself, I think for this working group is less relevant. Like, we can assume a single sort of logical location unit, so we don't dive into GDPR and China and any of this stuff. There is actually another working group that we're going to kick off called the multi-region DR working group, which Fabian, you will definitely be invited to that one as well, which I think will worry about these more the geographic location stuff and how that meshes with DR. But I think there also is potentially two separate problems of doing multi-region because of compliance reasons, doing multi-region because of DR reasons, and seeing when the overlap lies. But I think for this group, we can assume a single sort of localized location, and how do we, within the environment, are able to set up fences around certain things, either because customers demand that or because we want to make sure that some failure doesn't just either takes out the entire platform or forces us to stop the platform to be able to address what should be a small problem.
Okay.
Is that a fair description?
So the way I understand it is there are also then, I think, two different concerns, right? The one is about customer data, right, and associated data, which may, may be, the code, right, or their, their user data, metadata, all of those things, and how that is sort of separated from other parts, from other users. And then the second thing that I see is the, the shared infrastructure, like runners and layers that sit on top of this that do things, right, where, if that fails, right, it may affect several customers at the same time, right? Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, or a large number of. So the quantity doesn't necessarily have to be one, but stopping all runners and meaning no runners for 100% of the platform is very different than affecting 10% of the user base, right? So that's kind of where we're going with this. And then you may have the extreme case where a customer says, I want my own fleet of runners and I'm willing to pay for that.
Okay.
So, excuse me, I wonder like which layer does it make sense to start thinking about isolation? I've heard data and I've heard sort of background jobs, but are we talking about every layer here?
I think there are some layers where that makes sense, but I would focus first on the ones where we can minimize the so-called blast radius. So any layer where we have fully shared infrastructure, where a failure can affect the entire thing, it's probably where it's the thing that I would prioritize in terms of availability being this important thing.
I guess to clarify, sorry, Nicholas, is your question more on the data isolation or the noisy neighbor question, right? I think there's gonna be a lot of overlap on a lot of these questions.
Yeah, I'm kind of feeling like there is a lot of overlap, and to me, there's actually beneficial side effects of just deciding how to slice this. And yeah, to me, isolating data has side effect or beneficial side effects in different ways. Application layer. So I feel like there's a lot of overlap, which is hard because I feel like we're trying to segment it off, but
are we trying to tackle both at the same time, or is there one priority overriding the other, right? Is the noisy neighbor problem more important than isolation at this point in time?
I think one potential way of finding out is just to talk to a few customers and actually ask them what they value at the moment, because I think if the data isolation is sort of a showstopper and they're not even engaging with GitLab.com because that's not what we can do, that may be interesting to learn. And the other one, maybe they're saying well, as long as you can't guarantee that there is limited blast radius, this is too risky, but data isolation we can sort of live with. I don't know.
From infra, it's all incident driven. So the
noisy neighbor is probably higher priority.
The noisy neighbor is a primary driver, and where customers have brought up the isolation is to address noisy neighbor.
Okay.
It's just that when I talk about the feds, it's because I know that we'll end up in that. But right now, incident and blast radius limitation or sort of fencing off is the primary thing. And the one customer that we affected by having to stop all the queues suggested, well, what if you give me my own infrastructure? But that was driven by noisy neighbor, not by compliance in their case.
So if that holds true, it almost seems that if we resolve the noisy neighbor problems, customers might stop asking for isolation, at least in the short term, until there's a different reason for requiring isolation?
I think so. I mean, again, I brought up the federal government because I've worked with them before, and I know we're developing a federal practice, so those are coming at some point. but I don't think they're the primary driver right now. And I think if we solve noisy neighbor, we're probably going to get closer to the other isolation layer for compliance anyway.
Noisy neighbor is probably easier to implement and probably the right prioritization. Let's think incrementally. That's probably a good increment. Upgrades still impact everybody, and we'll need to be thinking in terms of how do we limit that, or how do we strategize around that? Do we do like a Facebook model where you do only a percentage of customers in some fashion, or things of that nature? And that's where you may see the isolation kick in, would be my guess from that perspective. So I agree with Jerry that's where we see the incidents, because so far we've been pretty effective at our upgrades. But as soon as we have a bad upgrade, which we did have one recently that affected customers, that's the case. The other case that I'm thinking about. So
I think my gut feeling without data is that our current customers, at least at GitLab.com, can't have such strong data isolation concerns. Because if they did, they wouldn't be on GitLab.com and would be self-hosted. And so the customers that have incident issues are probably focusing on the incidents from the noisy neighbor. But if we sort of in the future would want to attract more customers to our GitLab.com offering, especially in the federal space, then we would probably have to think about isolation and federation and all these things. So I think it sounds to me like the one is sort of an imminent problem that needs to be addressed, whereas the other is maybe, something that is a little bit more in the future, how we do it, how do we improve it to make it easier for customers to use this offering.
Well, then it almost seems from that discussion that that's actually given us a prioritization going forward, that the noisy neighbor problem is the one that we should be tackling first. And as part of that, we were identified that upgrades is one of those problems that occurs. And so one of the problems that creates the noisy neighbor events. And perhaps a next step from this meeting is to go into the noisy neighbor issue and list out all of the other types of problems that can cause incidents, and then start to work through how we would go about resolving those. How do people feel about that as a next step?
Yep.
Okay, well then what I'll do is I can capture I have recorded the agenda for this in the doc, but I can move some of this across over to the particular issue that relates to this. I'm trying to think who's best to list out, or who has the most information around listing out the problems, the separate kind of incidents that noisy neighbor problems are. Is that something on infrastructure?
That's Andrew and I, probably.
Can I ask a question quickly?
Yeah.
Like, surely most of the problems that you refer to as noisy neighbor are also the problems of limits, that there's a big undergoing effort at the moment across like basically all of engineering to add limits onto everything. And I'm trying to think of examples of noisy neighbors that aren't also limit problems. And I think they're the same problem. Sorry, I've got a bit of a bit better this way. And so I'm just wondering, like, is this a different problem from the limits problem?
But how is, for instance, the deletion of the GitLab code base limit problem?
But that
require us to stop the entire runner fleet.
In my mind, that's not a noisy neighbor problem. But is it?
Well, the solution requires us to start killing all jobs, right? We had to stop the queues to try and stop this job, which stopped everybody's work.
And essentially, we were the noisy neighbor. We were the neighbor that deleted, stopped everything.
In solving the incident, not even in causing it.
I mean, in that particular case, like we do have, the stuff that Craig's team has done around canceling jobs. If we documented that and we had that available, we could have used that. And I don't want to go into specific cases, but I just think that a lot of the things that we call noisy neighbors it feels like there's a huge overlap with the limits work that's ongoing. I just wanted to raise that. I'm not like arguing that it's not important or anything like that, but it just feels like there's a big overlap there.
Oh, there is, totally.
I mean, it's
I think we still need to do the audit, because I think there'll be additional things we'll discover from that perspective. I was going to actually suggest that besides Andrew and Jerry, we asked Stan and Camille for their analysis of what they think are potential hotspots. Craig as well might have other areas that he feels like hotspots where, hey, if we had 2 customers doing it. The other thing about limits that I've at least seen is we'll put limits in place, and then we'll have 2 or 3 customers who go to that limit, and then that causes effectively the noisy neighbor problem. So there's a little bit of limits definitely get you 80% of the way there. The problem is you got to get to 95% for good availability to still work. And I feel like there's still a class of problems. Does it get the majority of the problems? Probably. Does it get all the problems? I don't think so. And that's what we're trying to be proactive on as opposed to reactive.
To me, it sounds like not having a good handle on limits is one of the potential causes for some of the noisy neighbors, but there may be other causes as well, and that I don't know.
Right. Yeah. So here's probably a good example. We're talking about adding milestones. I just actually read an issue yesterday where we're talking about adding multiple milestones to an issue, and the question came up is well, what should the limit there be? And different limits were thrown around, and finally, I think the limit they're going to settle on is probably 1,000, which sounds grossly over large. Like I would probably pick 20, but at the same time, nobody's thinking in terms of isolation of saying, okay, like, well, if a customer does go to that large, well, how would we treat them differently, right? Or would there be granularity associated with that we would expect? So their experience would actually degrade as opposed to everybody's experience degrading, right? That's isolation in my book is that the person who's injecting the change in the system is the person that feels the pain, not everybody as a whole. That would be kind of my assertion.
The thing about stating a limit as well is that if you state a limit, then your developers, especially if you do it before the developers actually build the code, then they have that limit in mind. So at the moment, when somebody builds an epic, they're testing on their machine and they're thinking about 5 issues in the epic, and they're never thinking about 30,000 issues in an epic, right? But if at design time you say you can have 1,000 issues in an epic, then they've already got that in their head and they might be coding it in a way that handles that, as opposed to it worked on my machine with 5 and I never thought anything beyond that. So, like the fact that we're talking about that as part of the design going in is super, super fantastic. The other thing I'll say is that if we have a limit, I really hope that from a test team point of view, we are testing at those limits from the time that we build the feature and we start integration testing. Like one of the integration tests is always at the limit, or at least one.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the issues that I've observed where the limits are being introduced, people are starting to think in that way, both from the design and from the test perspective, the design build and the test perspective. And I'm also glad that this is something that's already in progress to try and help with resolving some of these things. But given that it is that the creation and enforcement of limits is already something that is in place and is being dealt with, I do think that it is also out of the range of what this isolation working group needs to be thinking about, because it's already being thought about and being actively worked on. I think it's something to pay attention to as it progresses, but I don't think that it's something that we have to put too much additional effort into because it's already in progress. Okay, well, we've got 5 minutes left, so are there any further questions that we want to address?
I think just for my own understanding is sort of the next steps that we're going to take is essentially saying this working group for the first step is going to focus on the noisy neighbor problem on GitLab.com. Then actually, put in a little bit of work to identify the current potential causes for noisy neighbor problems on .com. then there's probably a huge amount of discussion that needs to happen on, solutions for those causes, right? And then is the outcome or one of the outcomes of this working group to also say, okay, these are the 5 causes of the noisy neighbor problem. These are the recommendations for those solutions, and those are the teams or all the teams, that actually need to implement these solutions right now. Because just on a high level.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be the working group, the people in this discussion who are actually executing on it. It's the teams that are responsible for the given areas that are responsible for it. Probably a good example of this is ecosystem is responsible for at least some subset of the API. We assume that we want to isolate customers there, and we do rate limiting associated with that. Making sure that that's part of their expectations and implementation over there would be kind of the way to think about it. So there's an example. So, but I think your model holds, Fabian, from that perspective. The idea is to let's figure out what the things are we want to focus on, and then make sure we push to the teams that are responsible for them.
I think it's also maybe in terms of priorities. I don't know, but I think one risk that I see with this is there are tons of things going on, right? So I think gaining an understanding of how important the implementation work for this working group is against other things is also not something to be underestimated, because otherwise it may just not happen. And I think, at least in my mind, it's an important concern for many of our larger customers.
Yes, I think that's a fair point, and we'll have to put that in as part of this work. So yes, the next steps, as you have said there, we need to focus on the noisy neighbors problem first, as we've decided that is the most important of the two, and may delay or even push. Well, it may push back the idea of isolation, and even push that into only when it starts to reach a compliance or data isolation perspective. So the next thing we need to do is start to identify the potential causes that generate these noisy neighbor problems. And I think that, as Jerry said, this might be one for the infrastructure team to take a look at and list all of those out. And I think once we have a good list of what those are, we can then start to talk about what the solutions for each of those specific problems may be. So I'll take those as next steps to move those into the issues, and I will ping individuals for some help and some feedback there. Great. Is everyone happy? Is there anything else on anyone's mind?
Thanks for driving this, Rachel. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.